And I'm just wondering if you've thought or what you think about all this pre-attention to a legacy, either by an artist or if it's after the fact, shortly after the artist dies, changes itself the nature of the aesthetic experience for the future, as opposed to the time when artists didn't plan so much the concept of legacy and they let the works stand kind of on their own without that kind of observational focus.
I love the question because it points to an aspect I find actually the most interesting in this whole thing. I'll answer with 2 or 3 practical examples. I mean, Picasso, he was very believed in superstition and was very frightful of death. And he was so frightful that he said he believes the moment he does a will, he will die a second later. So he didn't make a will, and it led to 20 years of lawsuits among family members and trying them to find the right structure. So thinking about the legacy, yes, changes it, but I think often to the positive, because it changes also the people involved. If you're a daughter or a son of an artist and the artist comes up to you and says, let us talk about it, it's a very different situation than, for example, Donald Judd simply putting in his will he wants his children to take care of the legacy, and they were 21 and 23, I think, or in their early 20s. They opened the will and suddenly they were, boom, with this responsibility. And I think if you prepare people, it helps. And I don't know, probably many of you have been in the Adrian Piper exhibition here in the MoMA. I went there yesterday and saw that one work of art where she puts her hair and her fingernails in the cans. And this is an ongoing work of art where she will put as the last can her ashes as the body of work. That, again, I find a very interesting answer to your question. That it's, and it's something when we work with living artists and helping them to structure their legacy, I often try to build them an emotional bridge by trying to get them to look at the legacy as another, or maybe their last big work of art. So I get them in a part of their brain they're very used to using, and to thinking about it in a creative way, and not only sticking on laws and taxes and all that, but to put it into a creative process.
Thank you.
So I'm a conservator. Reinhard Beck is my name, and I have a question which is probably also the case it's mainly about Jean Arp. So when we work on, let's say, an artwork, and there is an estate which we can go to and ask and try to get some resources and go into the archive, we sometimes realize that there are 2 or 3 entities which call themselves the estate of this artist. And that sometimes becomes politically charged, and we have to negotiate that. I believe that's the same case with Jean Arp. To my knowledge, there are 2 or 3 of such entities. And maybe you can a little bit talk about that. And my second question is, coming from Europe originally, and I've worked in Germany and Switzerland, it always seemed to me, and now here in New York, it always seemed to me that artist estates here at least in New York, and the ones we work for, they seem to be very well organized. They're run like corporations, and I cannot even think of maybe 2 or 3 similar cases in Europe. And maybe you can tell us what the reason might be, because I cannot think of any reason. Thank you.
First of all, I share your observation. But let me start with your first question. I think what you're pointing to, and it is the case with Jean Arp, we have at this point 3 entities. It's always a fact, which is a pity, because I strongly believe in 2 principles for artist estates. One is unity. Also, if you only have one estate, it's so important that the stakeholders, the family members, are united in the cause. And I mean, art history is full of examples where that is not the case, and it's always to the misbenefit of the oeuvre and the estate. So the first one is unity. The second one is transparency. exactly what you say, that you, as an example given conservator, have the chance to access the archives, to access the information, because again, that serves the best way to treat the oeuvre. And there are many estates which don't urge for transparency out of various reasons. With ARP, just in sideline, it was the case that the French organization was originally 100% subsidiary of the German organization. And for tax reasons, inheritance tax reasons, when Margriet Hagenbach Arp died, we had to separate them. I wasn't involved at that time. It was 20 years before we got involved, or they had to separate it at that time. So today there are two entities, and the third entity is in Locarno, which was originally the home of Arp and his second wife, Margriet Hagenbach Arp, who was a big collector of her own, and it came out of her personal collection. So all the copyrights and the largest collection of work of Hans Arp are with the German estate. So there is only one estate dealing with all the copyrights, which is important. And at the same time, the three estates have now, since almost, I think, 20 years, found a practice of sharing all information on authentication requests. And that is really, really important, because that is to the outside world the most important aspect, and also where with other estates often a lot of insecurity to the outside world emerges if one entity gives authorization, another one doesn't. So just that for your first question. The second question is, I think there are a couple of reasons why the American field is so much further developed. First of all, if you think about the 80s and 90s, post the death of Andy Warhol, we had for the first time these super rich estates, where there was a need to really create a proper management, to step up to also that financial responsibility at a time when we didn't have that rich estates in Europe, which has to do with the art historical development of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the way art history in the Western world simply developed, being so important here, the New York School, the abstract expressionist, etc. That has shifted now, and I think that's why there's also a shift in focus, that the artists dying at in this period are also those from Europe have been very successful. And that will change the landscape in Europe. And I think there's a second reason, but that's only my personal point of view, is that the Anglo-Saxon world is traditionally much more used to seeking professional advice and also paying for professional advice. In Europe, you still often have this separation between the more left-wing oriented intelligence and the more conservative market side, and they don't interlink that much. And I think that still is the case in many cases, that they don't like to merge so much. But I think it will change because there's an outside pressure to change. And if a Polka estate, for example, I mean, such a fantastic, important oeuvre, there's no discussion about it. But they have to get their things in order to really step up to that responsibility, and they will.
Hi, I'm Ursula Davila. I work with artist estates. And actually my question is for Christian. You pointed to, and I will have to check my notes, but it's a word that you brought up, attentionality in the art or the artwork. And I wondered if you could go a little deeper into what you mean in terms of its concept and also where ethics comes into play when thinking about both attentionality and intentionality. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for this question. It's we have always just spoken about the intention or the intentionality of the artist, and the changing intentions of the artist, which is you can see that very often. We were just working on a case with Wolf Hostel where he always said yes and no, so we didn't really know what he was referring to, and it's not one size that you can count on, but it's very much a interpretation. And I just felt that the attentionality is something that also conservators are exposed to, which is like you see a work by an artist and you think, oh, it's supposed to look like this, and then this is the beginning of the problem. And also we sometimes deal with artist estates, and they say, oh, in my memory it looked like this, and I want this to look exactly like this. And so I think the conservation community, which has often been described as a truth-based discipline, which is not to, I think we try to really look at all the traces and all the little details that an artwork gives you to find out what is actually the truth of it. Of course, that's not the whole truth, but that's what we are aiming for. And it's not about authentication, but it's just to find out how did the work look when it was made. I mean, I think we are always aiming for the integrity of the artwork, and there are three kinds of integrity, which is the physical integrity, the aesthetical integrity, and the historical integrity. And I think the most interesting is the aesthetical integrity, because that's very questionable. But in art conservation, there's a lot of language about philosophy, and we use philosophy as a tool as a guiding tool, and we work, of course, with art historians and also with philosophers. And the reason why we're here today is also to share our doubts and our discipline and all our questions with a greater audience. And of course, that's the reversibility or the retreatability is something that we always have in mind, and that's, I think, our highest priority.
I am a conservator. My name is Alaonora Nagy, and this question is primarily to Loretta, but basically to both of you. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, Loretta, about coming up with the idea for this 2016 Artist Estate Conference, which I think was brilliant. I went through the whole thing, and being a conservator, I noticed that the issues of conservation was not really addressed at the conference, although I think it was extremely useful. Now, I also have to congratulate Christian to come up, as far as I know, with the first symposium which addresses specifically the relations between conservators and artist estates and foundations. So Loretta, I noticed that on your first slide, showing all kinds of aspects of estates and foundations, you did not have a separate entity for conservation. My question is, having just opened this symposium, where do you or would you place conservation now? And I am really curious that after 2 days of everybody talking about that aspect, how much it will change, or how much this symposium will change the opinion of including lawyers and foundations and art historians and all of other people involved in this whole business. This is basically my question to Christian too. Where does he place conservation now? And I'm really curious what will be the end of the opinion at the end of the second day. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a bit difficult to answer now. And I think it's simply, your question is much more a very important statement, that this conference is reassessing the placement on conservation within this field. So you're right, I should add it. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can work closer together with artist estates, and we sometimes feel some kind of fear or opacity from artist estates. They have a lot of information about the artist's work, but sometimes they don't know that they have this information. And I think it would also would just be for the benefit of the artwork and for the of the legacy of the work if estates and conservation and of course art critiques and research can all work together to have a better understanding of the artist's legacy and of the physical artwork. And we invited someone from an artist estate also to be at our panel, and the artist estate said, no, this person cannot speak at all. And then we thought, oh, this is interesting. We should talk about this. So we invited a lawyer to talk about exactly what is the authority of an artist estate. And I'm hoping that through our conversations and through our sharing information, we get a little bit more relaxed about working together.